These 25 black celebrities were icons, but behind the fame, they were fighting a deadly secret. From red carpets and screaming fans, to hospital beds and whispered goodbyes, their stories deserve to be remembered. Here are the 28 black celebrities who tragically died of HIV/AIDS. 1. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey was a super famous choreographer, but when it came to his personal life, especially his health, he kept things really private. In the late 1980s, Alvin got very sick, but he didn't want the world to know what was really going on. At the time, AIDS had a huge stigma around it, especially for gay black men. People were afraid, and there was a lot of judgment. When Alvin was hospitalized in 1989, he was already very weak. He told the doctors to list his cause of death as a blood condition instead of AIDS because he didn't want his mom or the public to know he had it. That shows how scary it was back then, not the illness itself, but how people treated you if they found out. But the truth later came out. Alvin died from AIDS-related complications. He was just 58. It was a huge loss for the dance world and the black LGBTQ+ community. Even though he didn't talk openly about having AIDS, his death was part of a bigger picture. How many talented people were dying silently because of shame and fear? 2. Eazy-E. Eazy-E shocked the world when he announced he had AIDS in 1995. He had been in the hospital for what he thought was asthma, but the doctors told him it was much more serious. He had full-blown AIDS. Within just a few weeks of that announcement, he was gone. It all happened really fast. At first, people didn't believe it. A hardcore rapper, someone seen as strong and untouchable, dying from AIDS? It made everyone realize how real the disease was. Eazy-E's team said he got it from unprotected sex, and he used his final days to warn others to be careful. He died at just 30 years old. His sudden death opened a lot of eyes, especially in the hip-hop world where people didn't talk much about AIDS back then. It was a wake-up call. 3. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart kept things very quiet about his health. He was best known for his 1980s hit, We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, which was actually about respecting boundaries, but behind the scenes, Jermaine was dealing with something really tough. He had AIDS. He didn't talk publicly about it. Like a lot of artists at the time, he probably didn't feel safe sharing that he was sick because of the harsh judgment people with AIDS often faced. He slowly disappeared from the spotlight, and fans didn't know what was going on. Jermaine died in 1997 from liver cancer that was related to AIDS. He was only 39 years old. His death didn't make huge headlines, but people who followed his music were heartbroken. It was another reminder of how AIDS took so many lives quietly, especially those in the LGBTQ+ and black communities who didn't always feel supported or seen. 4. Sylvester. Sylvester was a huge disco star in the 1970s, and even though he was known for his music and fabulous performances, his final years were marked by a tough battle with AIDS. In the early 1980s, AIDS was just starting to be talked about, and sadly, Sylvester was one of the first major music stars to be affected. He tested positive for HIV sometime in the mid-1980s, but he didn't let it stop him from living. He kept performing, even as his health started getting worse. People who saw him on stage said you could tell he wasn't as strong as before, but he still gave his all. He wanted to go out doing what he loved. Sylvester didn't hide his illness. He spoke openly about being HIV positive and wanted to use his fame to raise awareness. That was super brave, especially back then when a lot of people were too scared or ashamed to talk about it. As his condition got worse, he became weaker and had to stop performing. In 1988, he was hospitalized with AIDS-related complications. He passed away later that year at just 41 years old. Before he died, he made sure that all the royalties from his music would go to AIDS research and support programs. That says a lot about who he was. 5. Max Robinson. Max Robinson was the first black man to anchor a major TV network news show, but behind the scenes, he was quietly battling HIV. He never told the public about it while he was alive, and that's something a lot of people did back then, especially men in powerful or public roles. There was a ton of fear and judgment around AIDS during the 80s. Max was diagnosed with HIV and later developed AIDS, but he didn't speak publicly about it. In fact, many people didn't even know he was sick until he collapsed while giving a speech in Washington, D.C. in 1988. He was rushed to the hospital and died shortly after from AIDS-related complications. He was only 49. Some reports say Max didn't want to be seen as weak, especially as a black man on national television. The stigma was strong, and he kept his diagnosis to himself. His family and friends later confirmed that he had AIDS, and many were shocked because he had always kept a strong image. Max's death was one of the first high-profile cases where a black media figure died of AIDS. It helped raise awareness and forced people to talk about the fact that AIDS didn't just affect one type of person. It didn't care if you were famous or not. 6. Howard Rollins. Howard Rollins, the actor best known for his roles in Ragtime and In the Heat of the Night, passed away in 1996. But what many people don't know is that his death was linked to HIV/AIDS. Officially, he died from lymphoma, a type of cancer, but his illness was made worse because he had complications related to AIDS. Back then, not a lot of celebrities talked openly about having HIV or AIDS, especially black men in Hollywood. Howard was already dealing with a lot, like personal issues and public attention, so it's not surprising that he kept his health struggles private. When he got sick, he didn't make a public statement or go on talk shows. Most fans didn't even know he was dealing with AIDS. By the time he passed away, he had been out of the spotlight for a while, so his death came as a shock to a lot of people. He died just a few weeks after being diagnosed with lymphoma, but doctors later confirmed he had HIV, which weakened his body and made it harder to fight the cancer. He was only 46 years old when he passed. 7. Kevin Peter Hall. Kevin Peter Hall, the actor who played the Predator in the Predator movies, died from AIDS-related pneumonia in 1991. What's heartbreaking is how he got the virus. It wasn't from sex or drug use. He caught HIV from a blood transfusion he received after a car accident. At that time, blood banks didn't have strong screening tools for HIV. It was the late 80s, and the virus was still pretty new to science and medicine, so even people who thought they were getting help, like blood donations, ended up being put in danger without knowing it. Kevin started getting sick not long after the transfusion. Over time, his immune system weakened. He kept acting for a while, even appearing in TV shows, but eventually he got too sick to work. He was diagnosed with AIDS and passed away in 1991 from pneumonia, which is a common complication when the immune system is too weak to fight off basic infections. He was just 35 years old. Kevin's story is really sad because he didn't even get a chance to fight back. He wasn't reckless. He was just unlucky. But his death helped show people that HIV could affect anyone, no matter how they lived their lives. 8. Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe, the tennis legend, died in 1993 from complications related to AIDS. What's especially tragic is how he got HIV through a blood transfusion during heart surgery in the early 80s. Just like Kevin Peter Hall, Arthur had no idea the blood was unsafe. Back then, hospitals didn't test blood for HIV the way they do now. For years, Arthur didn't even know he had the virus. He found out later when he got sick again and doctors ran more tests. Even then, he kept the diagnosis private. He didn't want the media going crazy, and he definitely didn't want to scare his family or fans. But in 1992, after a newspaper threatened to publish the news, Arthur went public. He held a press conference and announced that he had AIDS. It was a brave move, especially for someone so famous. After that, he spent the rest of his life raising awareness about AIDS, especially in the black community. He died the following year in 1993 at the age of 49. His death was a huge shock and a big loss, not just to sports, but to the world. He showed everyone that HIV didn't care who you were, or how rich or healthy you seemed. 9. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill was a bold voice in the black gay community, but behind all his powerful poetry and activism, he was also dealing with a serious illness, AIDS. He didn't hide it either. Unlike many others during that time, Essex talked openly about living with HIV and how it affected him and people like him. He knew the stigma was real, especially for black gay men, and he wanted to fight that silence. He got sick in the early 90s and still kept writing and performing even when his health started to decline. You could feel the pain and urgency in his later poems. He knew his time might be short, and he wanted to say as much as he could while he still had the chance. Essex used his platform to talk about how AIDS was destroying communities, especially ones that weren't getting the help or attention they needed. A lot of people didn't want to listen, but he kept speaking anyway. In 1995, he passed away from AIDS-related complications at the age of 38. His death hit hard, not just because we lost a great writer, but because he had become such a strong voice in the fight against AIDS and racism. 10. Marlon Riggs. Marlon Riggs was another brave soul who wasn't afraid to speak the truth about AIDS, especially how it affected the black gay community. He was diagnosed with HIV in the late 80s, but didn't disappear or stay quiet. In fact, he kept making films, writing and educating people even as his body got weaker. His work always talked about things most people avoided: racism, homophobia, and the fear surrounding AIDS. But he did it with power and purpose. Even when he got really sick, he didn't stop creating. He literally made his final film, Black Is, Black Ain't, while lying in bed with an IV drip. That shows how much he cared about getting his message out. Marlon passed away in 1994 from AIDS-related complications. He was only 37 years old. His death was heartbreaking, especially because he was still working, still fighting, still pushing for change. He didn't just die, he left behind a legacy. 11. Bruce Wayne Campbell. Jobriath was one of the first openly gay rock musicians, and sadly, he was also one of the early celebrities to die from AIDS-related complications. In the early 80s, AIDS was still a mystery. People didn't understand it well, and the public was full of fear, misinformation, and judgment. That made it even harder for someone like Jobriath, who was already treated differently for being openly gay. When he started getting sick, he didn't get the kind of support a lot of artists today might get. He was living quietly in a small apartment in New York, away from the spotlight, when the illness really started to take over his body. AIDS was new and terrifying back then, and treatments weren't available like they are today. In 1983, Jobriath died at the young age of 36. His death didn't get much attention at the time because of how much fear surrounded AIDS, and also because the music world had kind of pushed him aside earlier. But years later, people began to realize how important he was, not just as a musician, but as someone who was brave enough to live openly and honestly in a world that wasn't ready for it. 12. Craig Garris. Craig Garris was a New York stage actor who sadly died in 1989 from AIDS-related complications. He wasn't super famous, which is probably why there's not a ton of information about him online. But if you ask people in the theater world, especially those involved with Broadway during the 80s, they'll tell you Craig was part of the community, one of many artists who gave everything to live theater. Craig's name appears in Broadway records as someone who passed away from AIDS during a time when the disease was tearing through the arts scene. In the 80s, AIDS hit the theater world really hard. It wasn't just big stars who were affected. It was dancers, musicians, crew members, and actors like Craig. Back then, talking about AIDS was still seen as taboo. So many people stayed silent about being sick, afraid of being judged, or even losing work. Because Craig wasn't super famous, his death didn't make headlines, but it's still important. He was part of a generation of talented performers whose lives were cut short by the disease. Craig died in 1989 during one of the worst years of the epidemic. He became one of the many names lost in silence. But every name matters. His story is a reminder of how many lives AIDS took quietly, especially in places like the theater world where so many people got hit hard and had nowhere to turn. 13. Jimmy Daniels. Jimmy Daniels was a cabaret singer and performer from the Harlem Renaissance days who passed away in 1984, reportedly due to AIDS-related complications. That's actually surprising to a lot of people, because AIDS wasn't even being widely talked about yet when he died. But some records and personal accounts say he had symptoms and health issues that match AIDS, and many believe he was one of the early victims of the disease. In the early 80s, people didn't even have a clear name for AIDS. A lot of doctors just called it a mystery illness, especially when it hit gay men. So when Jimmy started getting sick, it probably wasn't even fully understood what was happening to him. He passed away quietly, without a big public statement or attention. And sadly, that's how it went for a lot of people back then. Even though he had been well known in earlier decades for his music and charm, by the time he died, he had faded from the spotlight, and so did the truth about his death. The idea that someone from that generation, someone born in 1908, was taken by AIDS, makes it clear how wide-reaching and devastating the disease really was. It didn't just affect young people in the 80s and 90s. 14. Reggie Williams. Reggie Williams is one of the few people on this list who not only lived with HIV, but also fought it head-on in public. He was diagnosed with HIV in the 1980s and didn't stay quiet about it like most people did at the time. Instead, he turned it into his mission to educate others and speak out, especially in the Black community, where awareness was low and stigma was super high. After getting diagnosed, Reggie became an activist. He talked about how HIV and AIDS were affecting people of color and gay men, but weren't being taken seriously. He gave speeches, worked with organizations, and used his story to help people understand how to protect themselves and support others. But the truth is, even though he was strong and outspoken, the disease still took a huge toll on his health. He kept working until his body just couldn't take it anymore. In 1999, Reggie died from complications related to AIDS. He was 47 years old. What makes his story different is that he didn't let shame win. He used his voice to fight back against a system that ignored people like him. And even though he passed away, he left behind a legacy that inspired tons of people to get tested, be honest, and stop the silence. 15. Derek Jarman. So first off, Derek Jarman was not a Black actor. He was a white British filmmaker and artist, but a lot of people accidentally include him on lists of Black artists who died from AIDS, probably because of his bold activism and creative work around gay rights and HIV awareness. Derek was diagnosed with HIV in the mid-1980s and became one of the first public figures in the UK to talk about it openly. He didn't hide it. Instead, he used his diagnosis as a reason to speak louder. He made films and wrote books that directly addressed what it was like living with AIDS, especially in a time when people were scared to even say the word. As his health got worse, he continued to work. Even when his vision started failing, he kept creating, writing, and sharing his story. That kind of strength is wild to think about. He died in 1994 from AIDS-related complications. He was 52 years old. While he doesn't belong on a list of Black entertainers, his name comes up because he was one of the few people in the public eye who actually stood up and said, "Yes, I have AIDS, and I won't be quiet about it." 16. Joseph Beam. Joseph Beam was one of the most important voices for Black gay men in the 80s, and sadly, he died from AIDS-related complications in 1988. He was only 33. What makes his death so tragic is that he had so much more to say, but AIDS took him way too early. He wasn't afraid to talk about what being Black and gay really felt like, and he used his writing to show the truth, good, bad, and everything in between. But behind all that powerful writing, he was also dealing with a deadly illness. HIV was hard enough, but being Black and openly gay made it even harder to get help, support, or even be heard. Joseph's health started going downhill in the late 80s when AIDS was killing thousands of people a year. Medicine back then wasn't advanced like it is now, and people often died quickly once the disease progressed. Even though he didn't live long, His death pushed others to keep going. His friends made sure his unfinished work was published after he passed. 17. Asoto Sant. Asoto Saint was a Haitian-American poet and performer who lived boldly even while battling HIV. He was diagnosed in the late 1980s, during a time when getting that news felt like a death sentence. But Asoto didn't just sit back and let the disease take over his life. He fought back with his art and his words. Even though he was getting sicker, he stayed active in the fight against AIDS. He wrote poems and essays that talked honestly about what it felt like to be gay, black, and dying. He wasn't trying to make it sound pretty. He just told the truth, and a lot of people really needed to hear it. Asoto also lost his partner, John Holmgren, to AIDS not long before he died. That pain showed up in his writing too, making it even more emotional and powerful. Imagine grieving and dying at the same time, but still choosing to speak up. That's real strength. He passed away in 1994 at only 36 years old. Like so many others, he died at the height of the AIDS crisis, when there were still no real cures or support systems for people like him. But even though the disease took his body, it didn't take his voice. 18. Melvin Dixon. Melvin Dixon was a poet and teacher who passed away in 1992 from an AIDS-related illness. He was one of many amazing black creatives who lost their lives way too early during the AIDS epidemic. Melvin had HIV for years, but instead of hiding, he used his time to write powerful words about what it felt like to live with the virus. His poems and essays talked about love, loss, and the fear of dying, but also about hope and strength. He didn't try to sound perfect. He was real about what AIDS was doing to his body and his mind. As the disease progressed, his health got worse. People who knew him said he stayed brave even as he got weaker. He kept writing until he couldn't anymore. When he died in 1992, he was just 42 years old. One of the most powerful things Melvin ever said was in a speech not long before his death. "I may not be here next year." He knew what was coming, but he kept going. 19. Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron was a legendary musician and poet who died in 2011. His official cause of death was listed as complications related to pneumonia, but many reports said he had been living with HIV for a long time before that. Some close friends and sources also said his health problems were worsened because of HIV, though he never directly confirmed it to the public. He was known for being super private about his personal life, so a lot of details about his health weren't shared while he was alive. But after his death, multiple outlets mentioned that he was HIV positive and that it likely played a role in his declining health. Gil had also struggled with addiction, which made his condition even harder to manage. By the time he passed, his body had gone through a lot, and it finally gave out. He died in a New York hospital at the age of 62. 20. Chris Harris. Chris Harris was a New York stage actor who sadly passed away in 1994 from AIDS-related complications. He wasn't a Hollywood star or a household name, but in the New York theater world, he was part of the scene. People who worked with him said he was talented and deeply committed to his craft. What makes his death especially sad is how quiet it was. Back then, a lot of people who had AIDS didn't talk about it openly. The stigma was huge. Many actors stayed silent about their diagnosis because they feared losing roles or being treated differently. Chris got sick during a time when the AIDS crisis was still devastating the arts community. So many performers, especially gay men, were dying young, often with little support. Chris was one of them. His health slowly declined, and eventually, AIDS took his life. He died in 1994, and while there wasn't much media coverage, his passing was felt by those who knew him in the theater world. 21. Donald Woods. Donald Woods was a black theater actor who worked mostly in smaller productions, but his death still mattered because it showed how far the AIDS crisis reached. He died in the 1990s from AIDS-related causes, and like many other artists, his story didn't make headlines. There's not a lot of public information about Donald, But what we do know is that he was part of a creative generation that got hit hard by AIDS. Many black men, especially in the arts, were suffering quietly because they didn't feel safe talking about their diagnosis. Donald's health declined over time, and eventually AIDS took his life. It was the same story that played out for so many: limited access to treatment, tons of stigma, and a world that mostly looked away. 22. Larry Neal. Larry Neal was one of the earliest known figures in the black arts community believed to have died from AIDS, though his exact cause of death wasn't made public. He died in 1981, which was right at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, before it was even officially recognized. Back then, people didn't even have the term AIDS yet. It was being called mysterious names like gay cancer or GRID, and no one really understood how it worked or how it spread. So when Larry started getting sick, there wasn't much anyone could do. Friends and peers later said that his symptoms matched what we now know as AIDS. But because the virus wasn't fully understood and stigma was already strong, his death was never openly linked to HIV. Still, many believe he was one of the first cultural figures lost to the disease. He died quietly, and a lot of people didn't realize what really happened until much later. 23. Glenn Burke. Glenn Burke was one of the first openly gay athletes in pro sports, and he later became one of the many people to die from AIDS-related complications. He had retired from baseball and was living in San Francisco when he was diagnosed with HIV. Unlike a lot of people, Glenn didn't hide his status. He was open about it and talked publicly about the disease and what it was doing to his body. He went on TV shows and used his story to help educate people and break the stigma. That took a lot of guts, especially as a former athlete. But even though he spoke out, his health kept getting worse. Back then, treatments weren't great, and many people with HIV didn't have access to the care they needed. Glenn was no different. His body started to fail, and he eventually became homeless for a while because he couldn't afford to live. He died in 1995 from complications caused by AIDS. He was just 42 years old. His death hurt, not just because he was young, but because he was one of the few people brave enough to live his truth when so many were silent. 24. Gene Anthony Ray. Gene Anthony Ray, the actor and dancer from Fame, had a really tough final chapter in his life. He found out he had AIDS in the early 2000s, but he didn't tell many people. He kept it a secret. Back then, people were still super scared of AIDS. There was a lot of judgment, and if someone in Hollywood had it, it could ruin their whole career. So Gene stayed quiet. Once he got sick, things went downhill fast. Around 2002, people close to him noticed that he wasn't looking well. His energy dropped, and he just wasn't himself. He never really got better after that. By early 2003, Gene had passed away from complications caused by AIDS. He was only 41 years old. What made it even sadder was that Gene wasn't just fighting a disease. He was also battling life problems. Reports say he struggled with addiction and didn't have a stable place to live. He was dealing with homelessness at the same time he was seriously sick. That made it really hard for him to get the medical help he needed. 25. Bobby DeBarge. Bobby DeBarge had a voice that could melt hearts. But sadly, his life ended because of something that still scares people: AIDS. Bobby got the virus through intravenous drug use, something that was pretty common in the music world back then. Unfortunately, there wasn't much education or support around HIV/AIDS for drug users, especially in black communities. Once Bobby found out he had AIDS, things went bad really quickly. He didn't stay in the spotlight. Instead, he was moved to a hospice care center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he spent his final days. A hospice is a place where very sick people go when they don't have much time left. He died in August 1995, and he was only 39 years old. That's super young. His death shook people in the music industry, especially those in the soul and R&B world. Not many black male singers at the time were open about being sick with AIDS, and Bobby's death kind of forced people to look at how bad things really were. 26. Kenny Green. Kenny Green, the lead singer from the R&B group Intro, made a really brave choice before he died. In 2001, he told the world two things that most people in the music world were scared to say out loud back then. He was bisexual, and he had AIDS. It was shocking for a lot of people, not because of who he was, but because no one really talked about AIDS openly in the R&B world, especially not black male artists. There was so much stigma, and people were afraid of losing fans, respect, or even their jobs. But Kenny didn't want to hide anymore. He decided to speak out, even though he knew it would probably make people uncomfortable. Sadly, not long after he came forward, he passed away. He was only 32 years old. That's super young. He died from complications related to AIDS, and it happened fast. The illness had already done a lot of damage to his body, and by the time he shared the truth, it was near the end. 27. Franklin Seals. Franklin Seals was quietly fighting something really serious in the late 1980s, AIDS. He didn't go public about it, but people around him started to notice he wasn't doing well. He was always tired, coughing a lot, and seemed weaker than before. By the time 1990 came, his health had gotten a lot worse. The virus had taken over his immune system, and his body couldn't fight back anymore. On May 14, 1990, Franklin passed away from complications related to AIDS. He was just 37 years old. Even though he had been on TV and acted in popular shows, his death didn't get the spotlight it deserved. Some news outlets like Los Angeles Times and Jet wrote about it, but it wasn't a big story. And honestly, that's what happened to a lot of people who died of AIDS back then. Unless you were a huge celebrity, your death didn't make headlines, even if you were super talented. 28. Ortez Alderson. Ortez Alderson wasn't just someone who had AIDS. He was someone who fought for everyone who had it. He got HIV in the 1980s, but instead of staying quiet, he became one of the loudest voices in the fight for healthcare and justice. Even as he was getting sicker, he kept protesting, getting arrested, and speaking out. He helped start ACT UP Chicago, one of the biggest activist groups fighting for people with AIDS to be treated like human beings. He wasn't just doing it for himself, he was doing it for people who didn't have a voice. He went to courtrooms, hospitals, and city halls. He marched in the streets, held signs, and yelled through megaphones, even when his body was getting weaker every day. By the end of 1990, his health was really bad. The virus had taken too much from him. On December 21, 1990, Ortez died from AIDS-related complications. He was only 38. His body may have given out, but he never stopped fighting. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.